They were making more money than anyone in Japan. So much cash it stopped fitting in their offices. Executives moved it around in suitcases. But the way Nintendo made that money was becoming dangerous. Their business was tied to gambling. To distributors, the government wanted gone. And one new rule could have erased the company overnight. So Nintendo made a desperate move. They reached across the ocean and asked Disney for help. That single deal saved Nintendo, and it taught them a rule they would follow for the next 130 years. When staying the same means collapse, you reinvent yourself. To understand how Nintendo learned to survive like this, we have to go back to a tiny workshop in Kyoto in the 1800s and what Nintendo was really selling back then. In 1889, long before video games, televisions, or electricity in homes, a craftsman named Fusajiro Yamauchi opened a small shop in Kyoto. He wasn't dreaming of entertainment empires or global brands. He was hand-painting playing cards. These weren't ordinary cards either. They were called Hanafuda, a traditional Japanese card game. And at the time, cards were controversial. Gambling had been banned repeatedly in Japan, so every time a new card game appeared, it was usually followed by crackdowns. Most card makers went out of business. But Fusajiro's cards were different. Because gambling was illegal, these cards didn't have numbers. Instead, they had intricate paintings of flowers and seasons. Slowly, Nintendo became the name in playing cards, and people couldn't stop buying them. So successful, in fact, that by the early 1900s, their cards were everywhere. But there was a catch. Most of Nintendo's biggest customers weren't families. They were gambling houses. And many of those gambling houses were run by organized groups that operated in the shadows of Japanese society. Nintendo didn't advertise this. They didn't talk about it publicly, but the money was good. And for decades, Nintendo quietly benefited from it. That relationship would come back to haunt them later. When Fusajiro retired, he handed the company to his son-in-law, then to his grandson, to a young man named Hiroshi Yamauchi. Hiroshi took over Nintendo in 1949. He was just 22 years old, and everyone hated him. He fired relatives, replaced longtime employees, and ruled the company with absolute control. But Hiroshi also saw something no one else did. Playing cards had a ceiling, and Nintendo was already hitting it. So he did something radical. He decided that Nintendo should be more than just a card company. He wanted to own everything. But instead of sticking to what he knew, he threw money at every get-rich-quick scheme he could find. First, he started a taxi company called Daya. It was actually quite successful at first, but Hiroshi hated dealing with the unions and the constant strikes. He got frustrated and shut the whole thing down. Then he tried to enter the food industry. He launched instant rice, similar to instant noodles. The problem? It tasted terrible. It was a mushy, gray disaster that nobody wanted to eat. But his most controversial venture was the Love Hotel. In Japan, these are short-stay hotels for couples. While the hotels made some money, they were a PR nightmare for a company that was currently selling Disney-licensed cards to children. Most of these ideas failed badly. Some lost massive amounts of money. Nintendo was drifting, and worse, the gambling industry that had supported them for decades was shrinking fast. That's when Hiroshi made a dangerous pivot. In the late 1950s, Japan was changing. Television was spreading. Pop culture was evolving. And Hiroshi had a bold idea. What if Nintendo made playing cards for children? To do that, he needed a character people already loved. So in 1959, Nintendo signed a licensing deal with Disney. Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck. Disney characters on Nintendo cards. It worked better than anyone expected. Suddenly, Nintendo wasn't tied to gambling anymore. They were selling millions of decks to families. For the first time, Nintendo looked respectable. But that respectability didn't erase their past. And behind the scenes, their old connections were still there. And just as Nintendo was cleaning up its image, they stumbled into an entirely new business that would change everything. In the mid-1960s, Nintendo stepped into toys, not because it was glamorous, because it was possible. And this is where Nintendo found one of its most important people, Gunpei Yokoi. Yokoi wasn't a flashy inventor who chased the newest technology. His talent was different. He could take old, cheap tech and twist it into something people couldn't stop playing with. In 1966, Nintendo released one of its early toy hits, an extending grabbing arm called the Ultra Hand. It was simple, mechanical, and it sold because it made people smile in 5 seconds. That became Nintendo's secret formula. Not realism, not power, not the most advanced hardware. Just fun, fast. And Yokoi's approach quietly became Nintendo culture. Use withered technology in clever ways instead of racing competitors on specs. This mindset paid off again and again. Nintendo built toy after toy, and the business finally had momentum that didn't depend on card sales. But toys have a problem. They're hit-driven. One year you're a genius. The next year, kids want something else. Nintendo still needed something more stable, something repeatable, and then an entire new kind of entertainment began spreading across the world. Machines that could turn electricity into addiction. Arcades. Nintendo was about to enter electronics, and it was about to fail just enough times to get good at it. Nintendo's first steps into electronic entertainment weren't smooth. They tried different ideas. They kept learning. Then in 1980, Nintendo released the Game & Watch line, small handheld games with a screen and simple controls. It was brilliant for one reason. It made gaming personal. You didn't need a big machine. You didn't need a crowd. You could play anywhere. And while Game & Watch was succeeding, Nintendo took another swing. Arcades. In 1981, Nintendo released Donkey Kong. A simple story, a jump button, a big personality. It hit. And suddenly, Nintendo wasn't just a company that made toys and cards. They were becoming an entertainment company. But Nintendo's biggest gamble was still ahead, because the video game market was messy. Everyone wanted in, and too many companies were releasing too many cheap games. In the United States, that chaos turned into a full collapse in consumer trust. And here's where Nintendo did something that sounds boring, but changed the industry. They decided to control everything. The console, the cartridges. Who could publish games? How many? In 1983, Nintendo released the Famicom in Japan. In North America, it became the Nintendo Entertainment System, and Nintendo marketed it like it wasn't even a video game console, because video games had become a dirty phrase. It worked. Nintendo didn't just revive the market, they rebuilt it in their own image. For a while, it felt like Nintendo had finally escaped the cycle of near collapse. Mario exploded. Zelda became legendary. Nintendo became the standard. But the same trait that saved Nintendo, control, also created a new kind of danger. Because when you control everything, you start believing you can't lose. And that belief would lead Nintendo into one of the most famous betrayals in tech history. In the early 1990s, Nintendo had a problem. Cartridges were fast and durable, but they were expensive and limited. Compact discs were cheap and held way more data. Nintendo knew discs were the future, so they partnered with Sony to create a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo called the Super Disc. At first, it looked like a win, but when Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, finally reviewed the contract, he saw something alarming. Sony would control the Super Disc format. Sony would own the licensing rights for any games released on it, not Nintendo. That meant Sony would collect the royalties, approve the software, and slowly build its own power on top of Nintendo's brand. To Yamauchi, this wasn't a partnership, it was a threat. But instead of renegotiating or warning Sony, Nintendo made a silent decision. They walked away. Behind Sony's back, Nintendo struck a secret deal with Philips, Sony's rival. Then came January 1991. At CES, Sony confidently took the stage and announced the PlayStation, a console that would play both Super Nintendo cartridges and Sony's CDs. They believed they were revealing the future. The next day, Nintendo took the stage and shocked everyone. Nintendo would not be working with Sony. They were partnering with Philips instead. Sony executives found out in public, in front of the industry, with no warning. The humiliation was massive. Inside Sony, some wanted to abandon gaming altogether. But one decision changed everything. Sony's leadership refused to quit. The project was reworked. The space in the name disappeared. In 1994, Sony released the PlayStation. It wasn't an add-on anymore. It was a full console, built on CDs, cheap for developers, easy to support. And it worked. Developers followed Sony. Players followed the games. Nintendo's dominance was broken. Nintendo had survived countless close calls before. But this time, their fear of losing control created something worse. They didn't just walk away from a deal. They created their enemy. The GameCube was loved by fans, but it didn't dominate. Nintendo wasn't winning the console wars anymore. Not in raw sales, not in third-party support, not in cultural control. Meanwhile, competitors were turning gaming into a high-powered arms race. More realistic graphics, more cinematic experiences, bigger budgets. Nintendo could have chased them, but chasing them would have meant becoming a worse version of someone else. So Nintendo did what it had always done when the walls closed in. They pivoted. Instead of fighting for the same audience, they expanded the audience. The Nintendo DS brought gaming to people who never called themselves gamers. In 2006, Nintendo released the Wii. On paper, the Wii looked weaker than everything else, but Nintendo wasn't selling power. Instead of trying to have the best graphics, they focused on fun. They were selling the feeling of playing. Motion controls turned living rooms into something closer to a party than a competition. They brought grandparents and toddlers together to play virtual bowling in their living rooms. People who had never touched a controller before became gamers. The Wii became one of the best-selling consoles ever. It wasn't just a comeback. It was Nintendo proving again that survival didn't come from having the biggest engine. They followed this up years later with the Switch, a device that combined a home console with a handheld, proving once again that they didn't need to follow the rules to win. Nintendo didn't win the console war. They changed what winning even meant. Today, Nintendo is worth tens of billions of dollars. Mario is more recognizable than Mickey Mouse. Their characters span movies, theme parks, toys, and games. But what makes Nintendo's story so incredible isn't just the success. It's how many times they were almost erased by government pressure, by bad bets, by their own arrogance. A company that once relied on underground gambling money somehow became one of the most trusted names in family entertainment. Nintendo didn't survive by being the strongest, but because Nintendo was always willing to start over. However, remember that one decision Nintendo made created a rival they never expected, and a grudge that would reshape gaming forever. Learn how Sony took revenge upon Nintendo's betrayal in the next video.